Hi everyone, welcome to the week 5 feedback video. You've got Adrian and Richard in the studio. We've also got Craig overseas, so we'll be hearing from him as well.
Hi, it's Craig here, and so it's great to be with you all again. I'm here at the University of Warwick, just on the outskirts of Coventry, and tomorrow morning starts the second Mindfulness in Health and Higher Education conference. This year it's at Warwick, and there's a great team of speakers, including Ron Epstein, and he's from Rochester in the States. So it's going to be an excellent conference, and looking forward to it.
So the learners have really recognised the importance of relationships this week, which is really awesome to see. We've been focusing a lot on ourselves, and this week has given us an opportunity to really bring this practice into our relationships with others. Now, people have identified the challenges with technology, but at the same time, because the learners have been so active in the community discussing this week's learning topics, we see that the technology medium has actually enabled us to practice this mindfulness stuff.
Yeah.
We're going to throw to Craig for his comments on this.
There's been some really excellent issues and points that have raised, and one of the great things is that people are getting a sense that things are coming together. Various threads that have been woven in the first 4 weeks are starting to really sort of overlap with each other, and which is great to see. And that's really a sign of the deepening and maturity of mindfulness.
And one of the big things that's come up is learners are realising that it's very important to take care of their own needs so that they can more effectively take care of other people's needs. Because it's a very common habit, really, to put our needs aside to take care of others, but they can often be quite depleting. And I think when we start to pay attention and use mindfulness, we can notice that at times we might feel resentful, or it's sort of unsustainable, always trying to be there for other people, even though it's quite a strong habit.
It's been lovely to notice how there have been so many comments about the win-win situation, that you are mindful with others, and that shows them respect, and it helps a person feel valued and heard, but also in the process of being mindful that we also get the unexpected benefit of ourselves as well. So we feel better for being mindful, but it also helps others. And it is really a win-win situation, because if it wasn't, then we've got to make a choice. Do I want to feel good or help others to feel good? But actually, we all benefit when we're mindful.
And some learners in the community have actually really focused on the topic of switching into mindful communication and noticing opportunities when they engage in a situation and perhaps they're on autopilot a little bit and they're not focused on an interaction that's right there for them to tune into, and either being called on it by the other person or noticing the opportunity for them to switch into mindful communication. And as we've just heard, the benefits are for both. Not only when we absorb ourselves in mindful communication do we benefit from being more engaged with other people, but they benefit from that relationship and interaction as well.
And it's interesting how mindfulness, as you said before, it does start off being about us, but naturally becomes about how we interact with others and just how we show up in the world. But also there was an interesting comment made by some of our learners around how we teach mindfulness to kids.
Yeah, well, it's very important when we were looking at the comments around our family interactions often being a place where we might get distracted and multitask instead of tuning in. It's actually really important in our family relationships in particular that we practice being a positive role model of mindful communication. Particularly as parents with our children, they're going to learn ways to engage in interactions through the way that we engage with them.
Yeah, whenever I give presentations on mindfulness to teachers or parents, one of the most popular questions is, how do I get my kids to be more mindful? And of course, this can be young kids, it can be adult kids. You know, how do I get them to be more mindful? And I think the best way to do that is to model it. You know, to be that change, really. You know, if you come home from work and you're talking to your kid and you've asked them how their day was at school or at uni or whatever, and you're on your phone or you're already thinking about getting dinner ready, that's perhaps modelling to them distractedness and unmindful communication.
Yeah.
Whereas to really give them your attention, even if it's just for 30 seconds or a minute, just to really hear what they're saying, I think that speaks volumes.
Absolutely. And the learners really identified this week that there are a number of different interruptions to mindful communication and our active listening, and we're going to comment on a few of these right now.
Yeah, so one of the first ones was emotions, things like anger or impatience or frustration. When you're feeling these things towards people, it's very hard to actually, slow down and connect with them. It's quite common to sort of want to finish the sentence for them or just to judge or react to what they're saying. But I think mindfulness gives us a beautiful tool in that it helps us to notice those reactions, perhaps to let go of some of the beliefs that might be driving them, and just to bring our attention back to what the person's actually saying so that we can, of course, hear more clearly what they're talking about, but also connect with them on a slightly deeper level, perhaps with some more empathy or some more compassion.
Yeah, and what the learners will probably appreciate this week is how even in standing here, I need to be mindful of what Richard's saying, whilst also recognising that I might have a tendency to want to think about what I want to say next.
That's a good point, isn't it?
It's a common thing that happens, right?
Yeah, and that's life. And I think we go in and out of listening to each other, and then also thinking about what we want to say, and that's just part of doing this. Yeah. This is something that, of course, mindfulness can also help us, as well as noticing the emotions that we're having and the reactions that we might be having. We can start to notice that we do have a cloud sometimes of cognitive biases and assumptions that we make. Cognitive biases, of course, include things like anchoring biases, which is where we sort of believe something and even if we see evidence to the contrary, we move at a very glacial rate because we like to hold that opinion.
Yeah.
Or perhaps a confirmation bias where we start to filter out any other information that contradicts what we think. And we certainly see a lot of this in social media and politics at the moment.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting one with assumptions and biases that the community seem to be very aware of the assumptions that they held. And this is actually a really positive sign. We're more aware now of the sorts of things that were otherwise guiding our behaviour and our communication in the background. We're bringing that into the foreground now, and that means that we're able to do something about it.
Yeah. I really like that you're referring to the learners as a community, because there really is a sense of that, isn't there? Such support and sharing of ideas. It's really great to see. Yeah. Advice giving is another big obstacle, of course, to mindful communication. Not really listening to what people are saying, but just telling them what you think.
Yeah.
Trying to multitask, of course, we've talked about that already, just not paying attention, being on your phone while you're talking to someone else, that kind of thing.
Well, that's true, and there are a lot of challenges with technology, and we hear about this a lot in the workplace as well, that the ways in which we engage and communicate in the workplace have changed a lot with technology that's come into our lives at work, and so we need to be very in tune with the sorts of interpretations that we might have if we aren't able to detect all the elements of communication, particularly in digital forms that might be email or text messages.
Yeah, because it's often hard to read the tone, isn't it? Without the non-verbal feedback, the non-verbal components of the communication. You're reading an email and it's sometimes hard to tell. And as you said, we tend to fill that vacuum with our own sort of fears or interpretations or reactions. So.
Yeah, and so the cycle goes again. Yeah. Assumptions, biases, interpretations, and it's a lot that's going on in our minds that might not actually be connected to the reality of the communication.
Yeah, and of course, just even in face-to-face conversations, just really tuning into the non-verbals can help to deepen empathy, connectedness, and just help us to understand more effectively what people are saying. I think there's some research that shows that up to 80% of communication is non-verbal. It's the facial expression and the rate of speech and the tone of voice. And if we're barely listening to what the words are that are being said, we're certainly not catching much of that. So that's mindfulness gives us a good way of being more aware of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned empathy. It was certainly part of a conversation that was a bit complex this week, looking at compassion for self, compassion for others, and whether if you've got one, you'll automatically have the other. And I'm interested in your comments on that.
Definitely. I mean, empathy and compassion, they're different things. Empathy is feeling into somebody else's experience and understanding things experientially through them, and compassion is doing that and also wanting to somehow alleviate that suffering in them or the stress that they're experiencing, to do something or to offer some help or even just to make kind wishes for them. One of our learners noted that sometimes it's actually easier to be compassionate for others than with ourselves, and that's something we touched on last week, but it can go so far as I think some people not being compassionate at all with themselves and only being compassionate with others. And that's a very interesting situation, isn't it? I think to not really take care of our own needs at all, to not be sort of kind or present with ourselves, and always to be doing that with somebody else.
Yeah, and it is important to notice if that is a tendency, then it's really valuable for us to revisit previous weeks so that we can continue to deepen our mindfulness practice by bringing these different skills together.
One thing that I notice a lot in my private practice as a psychologist is that when people put their needs aside consistently to take care of others, and they do that over a period of time, quite often they start to feel depleted and also sometimes resentful. You know, maybe a bit of resentment builds up that we're not taking care of ourselves, even if we think that's the right thing to do. And sometimes mindfulness just helps us to notice that faint feeling deep inside, or that we're feeling tired all the time, or that we're really sort of not enjoying the relationship as much as maybe we used to. And once we start to notice those things, that can perhaps be a sign that we need to, you know, cultivate a bit of self-compassion, or even just take better care of ourselves physically.
Yeah, and learners are recognising that there are ways in which we compare ourselves and our growing mindfulness with how other people are engaging with us, and that can lead to judgmental thinking, and Craig's got a few things to talk about with respect to our own ego and judgment.
There's an interesting question. How can we unhook from the ego and become less judgmental? It's a big question, and we can notice ourselves in a situation where maybe somebody's not behaving well, or something's not going well, and we notice that there's a kind of a judgmental attitude. When the ego is involved, if we could use that word, then we might notice that the judgments are personal. They have a kind of a grip. They can, you know, the mind is agitated, and it's pretty much a sure sign that there's a kind of personal flavour to it, a kind of the ego's in the thick of it, which often exaggerates or distorts and so on. We might notice that we're feeling very judgmental, critical, reactive, and there's enough awareness to actually realise, well, what we might say if we come from that place could be inflammatory in the situation. We might make a mindful decision to just notice the judgment's there. We're human, and you know it's okay that it's there, but do I really need to give expression to that? But there is a kind of discernment that can arise with mindfulness, and it's judgment, but in a different way. It's not so personal. It's not so critical, and in fact, if we're really mindful, we often become more patient of the, I suppose, the struggles that others might be having. So that discernment is a very useful thing when it comes in. But because we're mindful doesn't mean that judgments and the ego doesn't arise. But we're able to actually perhaps get a little bit of distance, a little bit of choice about whether to express it, which is very helpful.
Some of our learners have asked about whether it's possible to be 100% mindful all the time. Yeah, I don't know about you, Adrian, but I sit at about 41% average, I think. You know,
maybe you're being a bit hard on yourself.
It fluctuates a little bit. But look, I guess here we get into what mindfulness is. You know, does it mean paying attention all the time to what we're doing, or is it maybe just more about the awareness that we have of where our attention is from moment to moment?
Yeah.
Because, you know, if the mind wanders off, that's maybe not such a bad thing, as long as we're aware of it, so that if we're having a nice daydream and there's nothing better to be doing, maybe that's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's really nice to call out. There's gentleness in the way that you describe that it is natural for us to have times when we're not being 100% mindful, and that's okay, as long as we notice and we do bring ourselves back if we need to be being mindful.
Yeah, and another interesting question came up around awareness. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into detail about that, but someone asked, where is awareness? In the brain, in the body, in the heart? You know, so where does that reside? And certainly there are some very interesting meditation practices, some mindfulness practices around choiceless awareness, which just involves sitting and just being aware. And you really start to get a sense that everything is happening in a space of awareness. That's a hard thing to describe conceptually, but for anyone that's starting to kind of explore this experientially, we'd strongly encourage you to keep doing that. And there are some great practices around that can help with that.
And in fact, one of the learners called out within the formal practice area, eyes open, eyes closed, and seemed to suggest that an eyes open practice gives an opportunity to bring these skills into a new realm. And I couldn't agree more. I've personally had practices over extended period of time with eyes open and found that very thing.
Just maybe half closing them, you mean, or just resting the gaze on the ground, or really open?
Resting the gaze and noticing the tendency for the mind to want to get engaged in something that it sees, that it finds more interesting than what we're doing, and just noticing that tendency and bringing ourselves back to simply resting in the awareness itself.
Yeah. Often without noticing, people sometimes use mindfulness as a way of avoiding certain situations. You know, I don't want to feel that, or I don't want to think about that, so I'm just going to focus on my breath. And sometimes closing the eyes is a way of sort of blocking out the world and experiencing a sort of a nice calm feeling. But of course then we've got to open our eyes again, don't we? So I think it's a good point that sometimes just exploring that and noticing, or asking the question, am I trying to block things out? And what does it mean to practice with eyes open? Certainly a good thing to experiment with.
Yeah. And
mindful listening as well.
Mindful listening, exactly, because here's another piece of stimulus. We're talking about our visual senses with the eyes open, but it's also true that there is constant stimulus around in terms of noise or in terms of the sounds that we can appreciate.
And it helps us to go beyond ourselves as well, doesn't it? Just to sit and listen to environmental sounds means that our awareness is outside of us. And we're starting to just really hear what's there. We notice that there's nothing we need to do to make the sounds happen, so that can be quite good. Get rid of some of that control agenda. And also then we can apply that when we're talking to people, to really listen to what they're saying, to really pay attention to a piece of music and actually fully listen to an album like we used to do in the old days.
Yeah, and it's the hidden choir is what it's been called in the TED Talk for this week. And we've noticed that detecting sounds can be quite a beautiful practice, and at the same time sometimes there are sounds that we find uncomfortable, and Craig has some things to talk about with respect to tinnitus that was raised a fair bit this week as well.
A question about things like tinnitus and, for example, or physical pain, emotional pain. But when we're mindful, and particularly when we practice the listening, we might notice something like tinnitus, ringing in the ears. And the principles of mindfulness have been found to be very helpful, to be able to notice the sound, but be less reactive to it, less fixated on it. It's like dealing with distractor influence. We try and block it out, get angry about it, and of course it just becomes more intrusive. So the ability to notice it, but not be so reactive to it, to notice it, but to just gently engage the attention, be more interested in whatever it is that we want to be interested in, means that something like tinnitus can be less intrusive, which is very, very helpful.
And so this really wraps up week 5's feedback video. So next week, week 6, is our final week. We really encourage all learners to continue not only with their learning, but in really applying what we learn, and as Craig introduced, deepening our practice by bringing all of these skills together.
Yeah. So thanks, Craig.
Thank you. I'll look forward to sending another report next week. And this coming Monday, there'll be another Mindfulness in Higher Education conference or summit in London. And I'll be speaking at that, as will John Kabat-Zinn and a number of people that are very much involved in university education and with the education department. And so there's a whole team of people involved with putting this together. And so it should be a wonderful event. So I look forward to reporting back then.
And see you next week.
See you next week.